Hello.
Hey, Steven.
Hi.
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 So
How was
Crystal.
everybody?
Alive and kicking.
Well, that's the only way to be. That's the only way to be. Well, we've got a little bit of work left to do in 21, Unit 21, that we're moving into 22. And so we've been talking about the whole concept of monotheism versus polytheism, recognizing these are terms that were created later and when we're kind of using them, on ancient texts that may not quite fit those categories. And we've also noted this phrase called, or this term called henotheism, which is recognizing that in that particular time and day, there were many different deities that were being worshipped, even if one was trying to worship only one. We also noted last time that as we move closer and closer to the first century, we start to see other language being used for spiritual issues or spiritual beings. And so the word demons starts to be used. And so the apocalyptic literature that we've seen and some of the other aspects that we've been looking at tell us that people were kind of in a transitionary period as they were trying to make sense of the world around them, what's causing, the things that they see in front of them. Is it, a deity? Is it some sort of lower spiritual being? And so you can kind of see the fluidity of these expressions as you go from older text to closer to the time of the first century. What we do know is that gods at that time were located with people. So different people groups had their own deities. And so when they were talking about passages coming out of the Hebrew Bible, or we're talking about passages coming from other sources, you see these references. So for example, in Deuteronomy 32:9, it talks about, or uses this phrase, for the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. And so this idea that the deities are connected to certain nations or certain tribes or certain people is a big part of that culture. This passage is from the Satires, from a satiric poet named Juvenal. He writes, a father sleeps more each seventh day, avoiding pork. The next thing that happens is his sons become circumcised, keep Moses' law, and despise the laws of Rome. So it was always understood that your loyalty should be to the deity that's your primary deity of your nation. And when that wasn't taking place, that was a cause of concern. So this kind of contrast between the laws of Moses and the laws of Rome is a part of that reality. The idea that there are other deities out there, but you're not supposed to follow them, is highlighted in Deuteronomy 6:14. Do not follow other gods, the gods of the peoples around you. Origen, in writing against a figure, a man named Celsus, says this: if the Jews maintain their own law, we should not find fault with them, but rather with those who have abandoned their own traditions and profess those of the Jews. So it was seen as, kind of not really a competition, but it was certainly seen as a tension. If you had somebody who was of a certain people group, a certain community, a certain society, and then if there was someone else who came through or was, maybe a sojourner of some kind, and they started presenting their ideas about the deities, if somebody was interested and started to maybe move that direction, then it was seen as a very serious situation. So the Romans really saw conversion to Judaism as a betrayal. And you see this in the writings of Tacitus, for example. People who convert to Judaism abandon the practices of their fathers. They disown their own gods, their own country, and their own family. So you can see the layers here: gods, country, family. They're all kind of intertwined because it's understood or believed that gods had places and holy spaces connected to certain people groups. And so if you turned your back on your deities, you were turning your back on the whole kind of ripple effect moving its way outward. Domitian went even further than that. It notes here that he even had some of his own family members killed for what was called atheism at that time, which was turning away from the kind of anti-gods, if you will. And it was really aimed at those who were following the custom of the Jews, most likely early Christians, because we know that Christianity was initially understood as a Jewish religion, and that disconnect between those two siblings, as we talked about, won't come along until later. Namdeo, go ahead.
Yeah, two things. One, so is it that this original view of atheism was turning away based on this to Judaism, not necessarily just turning away from God? That's one, because
Sure. Mhm.
there's a different definition to atheism today.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a different
Right.
definition. Yeah.
And also what I'm seeing here, it still applies, except for the country part, because even today, or when I became a Christian, it was viewed the same way. You're not loyal to following what we for generations have followed, even though we're in a different country, you know.
Yeah.
So I still see it and I still hear it today, that identical view.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think certain cultures, you find that certain families, there are some, as you know, still to this day, that's a very serious issue if somebody moves from one direction to the other when it comes to religious understanding. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, atheism is just really based on a Greek term, which is it's kind of contrary to the gods, and that would have been specifically applied to someone being against the gods of Rome in this particular instance. Now, we do have evidence, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, that the Pharisees were interested in making converts, but it was a difficult process, as we'll see when we get more into the area of circumcision and the issues that come up with that as we go into the next units. Continuing on in this, the idea that all gods form families is an interesting background when you think of what Paul was talking about, moving people's citizenship more into a heavenly understanding. So when we look at what's available to us in the earlier sources, it was certainly believed in many cultures and many societies that the rulers were the sons of God. That was kind of a common understanding, and that if you were a part of a society, then you were in a sense adopted into that family, connected to the deity, the primary deity that was there. And it was often understood that there were kind of a male and female team, if you will, kind of a mother figure, a father figure, when it came to the deities that were worshipped. So in this language from Romans 9, Paul alludes to this idea of adoption as sons in this passage. For I wish myself that I could wish that I myself were accursed, separated from Christ for the sake of my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh, who are Israelites, to whom belongs the adoption as sons, for whom is the Christ according to the flesh, who is over all blessed forever. So this phrase, who are Israelites, to whom belongs the adoption as sons, is just talking about how, as God made a covenant with the people of Israel, how they're kind of seen as, his children. And so that's probably a little bit more, direct relation than some of the other deities that we see, and because they don't really have that covenantal language that we have in the early Hebrew Bible. Philo of Alexandria gives a caution about how to deal with what you of the context in which you find yourself. He said that the Jews should show respect for pagan rulers who are of the same seed as the gods. Now, Philo was an early Jewish writer in Alexandria, and he was an allegorist. So he believed that he could make the Torah more understandable or more acceptable if he turned it into a very extensive allegory. So he wrote for Greco-Roman audiences, trying to get them to see the value of the Torah. And his attitude, it's hard to understand exactly the nature of what he's saying here, but it's probably mostly pragmatic. Philo was, as far as I can tell from my reading of him, was monotheistic and pretty devout. He did make several pilgrimages up to the temple, but he was probably encouraging his own folks to be careful about what they say, at least publicly, because that would be seen as an insult and even could be seen as seditious. So you wouldn't want to say anything, negative about a ruler or about its deity, because those were kind of seen as one of the same thing, or at least connected to each other in a pretty important relationship. So it's hard to kind of imagine, at least for me, to think about a world where every corner you turned, every river you crossed, every situation you encountered, you were kind of looking over your shoulder as to which deity or some lower spiritual being may be, tracking you or haunting you, or, maybe trying to do you harm. And then so you'd have to navigate life very carefully, thinking about which deities you had to sacrifice to, how did you appease them, how did you protect yourself. So every natural event would have been seen as something connected to the will of the gods. And if you're going to grow up in that context or be in that situation, as the Jews in the diaspora were, then they were going to have to navigate that, at least from kind of looking in from the outside. So they were trying to worship one God, but they were aware of there were pagan temples in the areas. There were idols that they could see other people having. And so their choice was to, try to live as respectfully as they could within their context, but they were not going to partake of what was happening around them. So as it come to the end of this unit, I do think the concept of henotheism is helpful, because it just reminds us that it wasn't so cut and dry. It wasn't just the case that ancient Israel showed up on the world scene and all of a sudden there's monotheism, there's polytheism. It was much more complicated than that. And it took a while for things to kind of sort out as to what people actually believed and who they were actually going to worship. Okay, so let me go ahead and pause this and move us over to the next unit. As I'm doing so, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to jump in.
Well, we similar to what you were saying in John 1:12. He refers to it, but as many as receive him, to them he gave the right to become children of God.
Mm-hmm.
Even to those who believe in his name,
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing statement when you think of what Paul was trying to accomplish. And I think it's somewhat similar. The language is a bit different. The way he expresses it different. But if you think about the gospel text, Jesus spends a lot of time talking about the kingdom of God, right? And about the kingdom of God as a spiritual reality that you could have within inside of yourself, right? So that's in competition with, or significantly different than what people would have thought. Coming back to what we just said, deities have names, places, spaces. If you're talking about a nation, you're talking about their deities connected to that nation. And so when Jesus starts talking about the kingdom of God as something outside of a national reality, that would have been pretty unusual. And so I think the way Paul perhaps builds on that using different language is heavenly citizenship. So you don't need to be in competition with other people. You don't need to have deep divisions amongst people, because if there is a greater citizenship, I think this gets back to this idea of Paul, the new person or the new man, right? That they don't have to be devoted to, things that could create deeper divisions or, conflict, because you could all be part of something, very similar. This kind of kingdom of God that would be within each person's heart.
But also the point you made about territorial gods, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we see in some of the Psalms, David referred to, the God. It starts like his God and God of his country, and then over all the nations, right?
Yeah.
So I believe maybe in Judaism, or at least it's expressed in that God of Israel was really not just of Israel, but the God of all nations, over all nations, I should say.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that how you you can imagine believing that and being in context where you didn't have any real political or military power, right? I mean, it would be an amazing belief, but if you know, think of the first century, you're a Jewish person living in the first century. If you're living in Israel, you got Rome oppressing you. If you're living anywhere else, you know, Rome's running the show. So to have this deep conviction, there's really only one God, and yet you're dealing with people pretty much every day that have, you know, significant different perspective about that. How would you help them to maybe come to a different point of view? And I think that's, like I mentioned before, there's evidence the Pharisees were interested in that. And there's evidence, as we've talked about before, that in these synagogues scattered throughout the Roman Empire, there was a section for the God-fearers. So there seems to have been at least some will amongst some of the Jewish people to let other, you know, non-Jewish people interact with the Torah, think about this idea of the one God. But the pathway fully into Judaism was difficult because of the issue of circumcision. So there have been some scholars who contended that Paul, as a Pharisee, was interested in this. And then as he had this encounter on the road to Damascus, that opened up his mind to another way of bringing or open up the world for the Gentiles to come in. They wouldn't have to come in through circumcision. They could come in through the message that he's going to preach about faith and his view of Jesus, right? So that creates an avenue for a polytheistic, superstitious, you know, world kind of in spiritual darkness to have access to the God that Paul knows. So it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about what he was trying to accomplish, while at the same time, as we've said before, trying to keep, you know, one foot in the Jewish world and still somehow honor and value, you know, where the Jewish people were at that time. Well, as we go into this unit, we're moving into the Roman world a little bit more fully, and, you know, still interested, of course, in how the Jewish people navigated the Roman world and then what kind of impact that would have on the Christians who followed. And so we'll start with the Roman Empire. And as you think about the ancient Roman Empire, what are some things that come to mind? If you had some just adjectives or descriptors, what jumps to mind when you think of ancient Rome? What comes to your mind?
Debauchery.
Say it again.
Debauchery.
Debauchery. Okay.
I was going to say immorality.
Well, we know
Cruelty.
Well, okay. So two important words, right? Highly immoral. In fact, we know that, you know, Paul struggled with that. That's why he included that moral instruction section in his letters, because he knew that a lot of the folks, if they hadn't been God-fearers, you know, knowing something about the Torah, they didn't really know much about morality and cruelty. Yeah. I mean, what are some things that mark Romans' cruelty?
Oh, gladiators, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
Torturing.
Yeah, torture, gladiator game. Gladiator, I mean, if you've never really studied that, I mean, we have kind of the movie makes on gladiator games, but if you actually study, it was even worse than the movies, right? So, I mean, it was a pretty intense way for, you know, to entertain Rome, and the way that, you know, people were, you know, pitted against each other. I mean, you'd be training with the guy in the morning and fighting him in the afternoon. It was often chosen by lot. And, you know, these were folks that often were captured. They were slaves. They didn't have any real choice. The only thing they might do is, if they were good enough as a fighter, they might eventually find freedom. But it was a brutal, short life. And it was all for the entertainment of the crowd, which would be up there betting on you. So there's evidence that in the morning, they had these kind of elaborate scenarios. They'd sit up in the Colosseum with, you know, they bring in some artificial, you know, like trees and shrubs. And then they turn wild animals loose in there with hunters. So there's hunter against animal. And there's evidence they wiped out lots of animals doing that. Then the halftime show was killing Roman criminals. And that was often where Christians were put to death, was in the halftime. And then the afternoon was gladiator versus gladiator. And this was entertainment, right? So you had people who were up there, you know, having their meal and betting and joking and watching people lose their lives, right? So that's a pretty, you know, thank you for that. So that's really, I think it's a graphic image, but it says a lot about the way people thought at that time. Any other adjectives? Anything else comes up? So immorality, you know, cruelty, violence, anything else that comes up about Rome? Rome in the first century.
Slavery.
millions of slaves. Yeah, thank you for that. Millions. Really a almost unbelievable number of people who served on so many different levels. You know, you had your household slaves, your field slaves, you had some slaves that had some authority to actually do things for their master, and others, of course, who had very little chance at anything. So yeah, a huge number of people that were slaves.
There was this divide. The rich got richer and they were powerful, whereas the people, not even Romans themselves, they were not given the privileges of the luxury life that the small little percentage of ruling people enjoy.
Yeah, significant class divisions between upper and lower class, and then even in the lower classes, divisions amongst them, right? So your status was determined by your heredity, your finances. I mean, you could make a little bit of movement. Sometimes you could move from one class to the next, but it wasn't the easiest thing to do. What we know about Roman society is that it's amazing that, you know, someone like Paul was able to navigate through all the different intricacies, from the political issues to the judicial issues, to the, you know, all the other aspects culturally that he had to work his way through, because Rome would not have been an easy place. Now, what the advantages he had in the Roman world, well, there were several. One is they liked order. They liked law and order. That saved his life a few times. So there was something called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. And that is that, you know, pretty much across the Roman Empire, it was expected that each vassal state would take care of their own business, keep the law and order, or they would send the Roman soldiers in and make sure that was so. Something else is the Roman roads, right? The enormous network of roads all across the Roman Empire made it possible, again, for someone like Paul to travel the way he did and to write letters. And where there's evidence there was a Pony Express, and that you could get a letter from one end of the empire to the other in about 2 weeks. And that's pretty fast if you think about the size of the Roman Empire. So there was the kind of the overall structure that had some benefit, made it possible for someone to travel quite widely. And then there's the other aspects that we talked about. So there's some evidence that in that time period, about 1 in every 4 people on Earth lived under Roman law at some point in time. The empire was governed by both the emperor and the Senate. We know that combination ebbed and flowed depending on what was happening at the time and whether or not they were at war. The emperor was elected for life, but if they wanted him removed, they had ways of doing that, which was assassination. And then all the stratus of society, the different categories, and we'll look at some of these in just a moment. If we're looking at a map, it's enormous how wide it was and the amount of area they controlled. If you're talking all the way back, all the way over into England and Spain, along the African coastline, of course, up through Israel, Egypt. We know that they imported bread from Egypt to feed the people in Rome. That was a fairly common thing. And all the way over into Mesopotamia. Here's the Persian Gulf. So just a pretty amazing, breadth of control. And then armies all along the borderlands to keep back the so-called barbarian tribes, as they were known at that time. Well, to give us a little bit more background, I'm going to show a brief clip. This is just going to get us into some of the basics of the development of the Roman Empire, and then we'll re-engage. So give me a moment and I'll bring this up. And again, please let me know if there's any problems with hearing it. There's so much information on ancient Rome. I'm sure as you've encountered probably in a variety of places. This is a video clip that comes from the National Geographic, and so I really appreciate some of the things that they cover here. Like I said, we're going to show a few minutes of it, but if you want to look at more of it, it's the Ancient Rome 101 National Geographic. This is just a portion of it. So let me bring this up.
The story of ancient Rome is a story of evolution, of how a civilization's ability to adapt and dominate can lead to its survival for over 1,000 years. Rome began as a small village on central Italy's Tiber River. In the coming centuries, it grew into an empire that stretched from the North Atlantic all the way to the Persian Gulf. During this transformation, Rome displayed a political, military, and cultural prowess that enabled it to become a superpower and helped shape what would become known as Western civilization. The lifespan of ancient Rome can be divided into 3 major periods: the regal, the republican, and the imperial. During the regal period, Rome was monarchical and ruled by a succession of about 7 kings. Rome's first king, according to legend, was a man named Romulus. He and his twin brother Remus are said to have founded Rome in 753 BC. In 509 BC, Rome adopted a republican system of governance in which the state was primarily ruled by 2 annually elected representatives called praetors, who were later called consuls. One of them became a famous general and dictator, Julius Caesar. The imperial period followed. It was characterized by the rise of the Roman Empire and notorious leaders such as Octavian, Rome's first emperor, who ushered in an era of peace, and Nero, who, some scholars believe, was Rome's cruelest emperor. Rome's focus and pride in its military was vital to the civilization's growth, and this ethos was evident as early as the regal period, when Rome was only a small village. Still, Rome slowly conquered and annexed neighboring peoples. This slow and steady expansion eventually led to the Romans' domination of the Italian peninsula and the entire Mediterranean Sea, where they conquered the Greeks, Egyptians, and Carthaginians. Military conquests would later help Rome conquer lands as far away as Britain and Iraq. This massive scale and growing populace necessitated advancements in Roman engineering. Aqueducts were constructed, which increased the public's access to water, helped improve public health, and paved the way for Rome's famed bathhouses. A 50,000-mile-long road system was built as well. While made originally for the military, it facilitated the movement of people and ideas throughout the empire.
Okay, let me go ahead and close it there. So just some nice a bit of overview as to how it grew and developed, and of course the significance of the military in making that possible. Joining with neighboring city-states initially, creating defensive alliances, and then going ever wider and expanding. And what they found out, of course, is that the more they connect with other cities and villages, the larger they can make their army, and the larger they made their army, of course, it just kind of, went along those lines. Let me go ahead and pause this, and then we'll move back. As I mentioned before, if you take some time and look at just the political changes that took place in Rome over time, it's very fascinating and gives us some insight as to the way they looked at the world and the way they saw themselves in that unique position as in having dominance over the whole area. So a vast collection of states, as we know, for example, Herod the Great, he was a puppet king or a client king, as some would say. And so he had the capacity to maintain his own army as long as he used it for their purposes and to keep the Israel in a place of calm. If there was ever a time there was an internal fight, like a civil sort of disobedience, that's when the Roman soldiers would come in. Otherwise, they tried to keep them off of the the main thoroughfare of each vassal state, because they didn't want to make people upset and create a context for war. What we do know is that regardless of how one looks at the Roman Empire at a positive or negative light, that they did achieve some amazing things architecturally, in terms of the aqueducts and the different things that they built up, and as we mentioned with the roads. And it was a place where you could communicate ideas. There are places you could go to share what your beliefs were, and trade was very much valued and supported. The social structure, we've already alluded to this. We know that many people in the Roman society didn't have really, good standing. So obviously slaves would be in that category. Women did not have independent status. Children were, not that important unless the father extended his support of them. So a child wasn't considered a member of the family until the father said it was. So we actually have evidence of letters in which a man wrote his wife and said, if a baby is a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, throw it away. And so infanticide was practiced in ancient Rome. So if you lost a child, you could go to the town dump. There would probably be a baby there. And we know that some of the slavers actually, did this. They took children and raised them up and made them slaves. So infanticide is how they did this, and it was solely based on the evidence that we have by the father's decision. So a child was in Greek, a child's a teknon, and that's neuter. It's not even male or female, right? And so until the father extends his name to the child's not a member of the family. So it gets back to something Sarah knows just about this kind of cruelty and what people valued, and also just the power of a patriarchal society. And it's into that context, when Paul starts writing about equality, as we've seen in the book of Galatians. So very much a society based on social status and social class, with the emperor and his family on top. Then you'd have the patricians, who were coming from the original Roman Senate. And these would be the ones that had the most land, the most property, and the most wealth. Then you'd have the senators. Some of those could be patricians, and there is a possibility that they could have come up from the equestrian class. They functioned as judges and government officials and provided counsel to the emperor. The equestrians were originally from the cavalry, and they were ones who became businessmen, bankers, and so forth. With enough money, they could move up into the senator class. So you did, like I said, there was potential of some movement from one to the other, but really not too easy, and it wasn't accomplished very much. The vast majority of people would be much lower than that. So we had the plebeians, and there's some evidence that there was like 6 classes of plebeians based on their wealth. And so even within their context, they're, kind of competing with each other. Then you'd have women, slaves, freedmen, and foreigners. Women were citizens, but they did not have the right to vote. Slaves, of course, had no rights. They were just property. There were some who, through the gift of their master or through maybe earning, they could buy their way out, or somebody else might buy them out. We actually know that one of the early Christian practices was to buy people, set them free. So there's even evidence of some early Christians who sold themselves into slavery to get enough money to free somebody else who was in the hands of a cruel master, right? So that was something that is referred to in some early literature. Foreigners were considered subjects of Rome. They had to pay taxes and enjoyed some protection, but they had no rights as citizens. So with an empire that vast, you can imagine the different people groups that could be encountered in any given day, particularly coming in and out of Rome. Now, when it comes to the impact on understanding things in the New Testament, well, Paul, of course, is our primary figure because of his movement throughout the empire. So we have a passage like this in Acts 22, where we see Paul using his Roman citizenship to protect himself. So we see here, it says, the commander ordered him, Paul, to be brought into the barracks. Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. The commander came and said, tell me, are you a Roman? He said, yes. The commander answered, I acquired the citizenship with a large sum of money. Paul said, I was actually born a citizen. Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let him go. And the commander was also afraid when he found that he was a Roman, because he had put him in chains. All right, so that tells us, even though as we've said, Rome was a pretty dark place on a lot of levels. They did believe in law and order, and that, was beneficial to Paul in certain settings. I'm sure you are seeing this, the idea of scourging. What does that mean? They were talking about scourging, examining. What does that involve?
Whipping.
Yeah, it's whipping. Yeah.
Yeah, but didn't it have little bone spikes at the end of the whip, and then it tears up your flesh when they kind of like flop at you with it?
It depends. Yeah, and I know that they use that in certain settings. I think it depends on the accusation and what they were trying to do. So in this case, if they were examining somebody, as it says, where is it? Where they're about to examine him. So they could use a little bit less intense scourging if they just wanted to question him. Hurt him bad enough to, get information from him, not bad enough to kill him. But we know that, Paul was whipped several times. He was actually scourged a number of times. And as you can imagine, regardless of if it was to the extent that, we know it could be, his back still would have been, pretty much shredded.
In
And
Singapore,
then
they still use it.
yeah, and then he would have to heal up, right? So then it would just be scar tissue on his back, and then they do it again, right? And then so he had, some think that Paul was fairly crippled up, and that he might have. You may recall in his letters, there's some reference to his eyesight, and he used a secretary to write some of his letters for him. And some think that, maybe when he got hit a few times, that it hurt his eyesight. So we imagine someone who, probably towards the end of his life had quite a few scars on his body from all of this mistreatment. What's interesting in this passage is how quick the things turn as soon as they learn he's a citizen, right? That just shows you that the reach of the law could get to some of these smaller communities if you mistreated somebody. This passage has always been interesting because of what Paul had the capacity to do when it came to seeking justice. So this is in Acts 25. The context is that Paul had been charged with disrupting law and order in Jerusalem. Remember, he had gone up there to fulfill a vow, and that created a stir because some people thought he was bringing a Gentile into the temple. And so he had been arrested, but it wasn't safe for him there. So he was taken to Caesarea. And he was under, I think it was Felix for about 2 years, who was a governor, who wouldn't release him because he thought he could get a bribe out of it. So he thought that Paul was going to bring up some money. Of course, he never did. So when it finally changed and there was a new governor, then Paul was able to present his case. Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
Was there any indication of what class Paul was considered to be a part of under the Roman hierarchy?
There's a really good paperback, and I'm trying to think of his name. I think it's a German scholar. I'll have to look at if I can. I might even actually have it. I'll send you a reference to it. But he makes the case, and F.F. Bruce is a good Pauline scholar. They try to explore Paul's background. And the case they often make is he was probably from a middle-class family, and it's based on the idea that if he was born in Tarsus, but he was trained in Jerusalem, that would have taken some money to do that. And if he was a tent maker by trade, then maybe his family had a tent making business in Tarsus that supported the family, something he would have learned and then later used when he was traveling to, pay his own bills. And so the combination of the reference to tent making, that he went and trained under Gamaliel, right? That means he had to have stayed in a certain place and had money to support himself. So the best evidence I've seen based on, different scholars' reconstruction is that he probably was from a middle class family. Now, as we saw in the previous slide, he did not buy his citizenship. He was born into it. And there's different theories as to how that happened. The best theory I've read is that there was a time when prior to Paul's birth, that the city of Tarsus had supported the military effort of a certain emperor, and that emperor wanted to acknowledge that. So he gave everybody in the city citizenship. And that it happened several generations before. And so that's how he got it. Now that's it. Like I said, what happens is you have bits and pieces of information from Paul's letters, Acts, and a few other documents. and then they try to reconstruct that. So, not everybody agrees with that, but I'm of the opinion that they've made a pretty good case that probably middle-class family. That also, by the way, connects with what we know about the Pharisees. They were generally understood to be more businessmen, people who had some means that allowed them to, take care of their family, but also to study. Because that was a big deal. To have time to study was a big issue. Well, coming back to this scenario, what's given to us in the book of Acts, Paul's been sitting in prison for a couple of years, and, he's just sitting there and he can't go anywhere. So finally, he was able to make his case. He says, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. But if none of these things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. So he's saying, you can't send me back to Jerusalem. Then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, give appeal to Caesar you shall go. And of course, that's the part of the book of Acts where Paul is put on a boat and travels, and there's the shipwreck and all that. But this idea of appealing to Caesar was something only a Roman citizen could do. And it would be like appealing to the Supreme Court. That'd be about the highest law of the land. And the evidence suggests that he made it. So you have two bits of information. One is what the early church fathers write about the end of Paul's life, and also what happens in the book of Acts and some other scattered references. So the evidence suggests that Paul, after he had gone about as far as he could from Antioch of Syria, he'd do his journey and come back, do his journey and come back, his three great missionary journeys, he wanted to start a new missionary outreach from Rome. And so that was his plan. And so he gets to Rome, and as you know, the book of Acts closes with him under house arrest, and visitors are coming to see him, right? It doesn't look like he's being threatened or there's any sort of issues, but we know he dies in Rome, according to the church fathers, and he's beheaded. So there's a bit of a historical gap between the end of the book of Acts and what we know about the end of Paul's life. So the reconstruction is that he does go stand before Caesar. He is released. Some think he evangelizes some members of Caesar's household, and that's how they end up, coming to faith. And then he goes to Spain. But when he's in Spain for a year or two, he hears about the Neronian persecution, where Christians are being killed. So he rushes back to support the church in Rome, and he's arrested, and then he's beheaded. So that's the same persecution that Peter would have died in. But as you recall, Peter didn't die by beheading. How did he die?
He was crucified upside down.
He was crucified, right? So you didn't crucify a Roman citizen. That's a bad way to die, right? If you have a strong person, basically, they got to keep their diaphragm open to breathe. But when they do, they got to pull against the nails. So they either get the pain from the nails on the feet and the hands, or they start to suffocate, right? So they're spending all their time doing this, and so it's just a horrible, brutal way to kill somebody. Beheading doesn't sound like, a great way to die either, but it was fast, if the guy knew what he was doing. So that's the evidence that we have, is that he did get killed in that persecution. And as you're probably aware, it was all based on a lie, as far as we can tell, that Nero had told. So Nero wanted to rebuild a part of the city of Rome in his own honor, and the Senate said no. And then shortly thereafter, there was a great fire of Rome, and they thought, okay, see, Nero did it, which he probably did. So he got scared. So he blamed the Christians because there was already some rumors about them. They weren't, really worshiping the gods. They were an easy scapegoat. And that was the first great, persecution of Christians, but it was mostly just in Rome. It wasn't the wider spread persecution that'll come later in the later part of the first century. All right, so yeah, go ahead.
If I can say, there's a beautiful church, a big church, I don't know, basilica, dedicated to St. Paul, that is outside the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And where was found his prison, I think.
Yeah, there's some Yeah, there's some interesting archaeological finds. They think they know the spot where he was beheaded. There's at least there's a tradition for that. I'll make a note and see if I can give you some more information on that.
It's one of the major church in Rome. I've been there, but
Yeah, there's a church there now. Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. That was just a good reminder. Okay, so Jews among Romans. Here's the world in which they find themselves. Paul obviously was Jewish, and he was, navigating that. But as being a Roman citizen, that put him in a little bit different category. What we know is that the Jewish people could have made up a significant amount of the population. Some think as much as 5 to 10% of the general population. That being the case, there may have been more Jews living in the diaspora than there were actually living in Israel, which has actually been fairly common for many, many years. The evidence is the Jews were initially very respected. They actually had special status. Josephus tells us that they had some protection, that their religion was considered a legal religion. They were exempted from having to, offer up idol sacrifices to idols, or even serve in military service. They had a special status in the Roman Empire. Now, there's a bit of a debate among scholars as to how they got that status. Some have thought that it was because there was more of a wider policy, more like a formal policy. Others have said, no, if you look at the evidence, it's more the case that you had times and places, particularly in the latter part of the 1st century BCE, about 50 years before Jesus, that there were different Jewish communities throughout the Roman Empire who were protesting the way they were being treated. And so they did these kind of decrees for community by community. But over time, that collectively kind of came to be understood that the Jews had some legal protection. And what the scholars that I've read in this area say, it wasn't because Rome cared at all about Jewish people having freedom of religion. They just wanted peace. They just didn't want to have a community in different, communities in different parts of the Roman Empire being attacked by other communities, because then they'd have to send soldiers in to deal with it. They didn't want to do that. So they basically said, look, the Jewish people are exempt in these areas, leave them alone. Right. So that was kind of how they set that up. Now, there is a subset of scholars who don't know if the picture is as clear as Josephus says, because Josephus is our primary source. So just be aware that, the scholarship in this area, there's differences of opinion. Certainly, the view of the Jewish people changed dramatically with the Jewish-Roman War. So whatever they had that was able to extend an umbrella to the early group called the Way, because they would have understood as Jewish, became problematic after 66, because now you have the Jewish-Roman War. If you are a Gentile believer in Jesus and you're being classified as a Jewish religion, you wouldn't want that after 66, right? I mean, that now becomes a tension. And that gets into some of the things we talked about of, de-Judaizing, right? Moving away from the Jewish roots because it was no longer really beneficial. When we talk about the siblings in light of Rome, just a few comments. If we're talking about the people of land, they had been under oppressors before, right? So generations of oppression. They'd had about 90 years of freedom under the Hasmoneans, but this was not that uncommon to be under oppressors. So they would have navigated that. They would have paid their taxes, but we knew they were not happy about it. And whenever tax collectors were appointed in Israel, the common people usually had to pay twice. They had to pay whatever the tax collector was collecting for the Romans and then for themselves, right? So that's why when we have these passages about the tax collectors in the Gospels, they're not obviously very popular because they were seen as traitors because they were working with Rome, and they were seen as cheats or, people who were basically robbing the people. So the common people would have navigated as common people do. They would have put up with it. They would have survived. But they wouldn't have had any sort of official policy unless they threw in with some of the other folks. What we know from the Gospels, that Jesus really was encouraging the people he was preaching to not to resist them, turn the other cheek. He's not talking about just some random neighbor. He's talking about a Roman soldier. If somebody forces you to take something 1 mile, go 2. Who's going to do that? Roman soldiers, right? Love your enemies. Who's the biggest enemy Israel had at the time? Roman soldiers. So he's preaching this at the exact same time that the zealots, the militant Jewish people, are saying the opposite. Resist, fight. They were in guerrilla warfare before the war ever started. They were coming up behind Roman soldiers and assassinating. So there would have been a huge split. The biggest split I can see in the first century between Jesus and another Jewish subset would be the zealots. That would be the biggest split. Because he was trying to stop the war from happening. You go back and reread how many times he's warning about what will happen, and even in the Gospel of Luke, as he's carrying his cross, remember he says, "Don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves." He's talking about how one stone won't be left upon another, right? So he's looking out. He's looking down the road about 30 years, seeing a war that's coming, and it's going to be catastrophic. There's estimates that some 850,000 Jews were killed in that war. Temples destroyed, Jerusalem is destroyed, right? I mean, I think that's, from my angle of reading about, some key issues in the Gospels, he, among many things, was trying to redirect them. Don't think of it as you have to get rid of Rome to have a context for, worship of God, because worship of God is an internal issue. The kingdom of God is within you. Right? It's not some sort of external reality that you have to create by destroying the Roman Empire. Yeah, Namdeo.
Yeah. So I'm trying to rationalize when we look back at certain cultural issues that the church was formed in, right? But it takes a different slant. I'll tell you where I'm coming from. For instance, in the Old Testament, we would see people having multiple wives, concubines, and stuff like that, right? So they categorize it, and that was just like, okay, right? Abraham and those guys. And then we see the Jewish people in the time of the Romans, but we kind of categorize them as immoral and that sort of thing. But yet in that time, the church now gets a different kind of standard with respect to like family life. I categorize all that. And I'm trying to see how we justify it in the Old Testament and how we kind of spurn it in this time in with the Roman influence and all that.
Well, it's a good question. I would probably come at it a little differently. We know that through the development of the oral law and the Mishnah and the Talmud, things that we've looked at, the rabbis were really pushing away from having more than one wife, right? So they were already narrowing that down. So they already saw the trouble with that, and so they were moving that direction. When you get into, for example, Paul's qualifications for an elder, it can be a husband of one, or husband of one wife, right? And that's in Timothy. So clearly that is in place by that time, probably reflecting to some extent his experience in the Pharisaical world. So I think you have an emerging understanding of what does it take to have peace in a family, and having more than two people in a committed relationship or raising their children and so forth creates an extra dynamic that's very difficult to navigate and have peace in the family. And I know that's kind of where rabbinic text comes from. And I think Paul's coming at it from the issue of leadership. How can a person who's got multiple wives, how is he going to navigate that, being a leader in a context like that? So that's how I would see that development, is really solidification of that concept more on a rabbinic side, and more from the early rabbis, and how that kind of comes into Christianity through the writings of Paul. So anyway, coming back into this I'm going to go a little bit further before we close. So as we mentioned, the people of Qumran, the Essenes, they were looking for two messiahs, a priestly and a military one, but they weren't like the zealots. They didn't throw out the zealots, right? The Romans were doing their thing. the scenes we're doing there is at some point God will bring it all around, and then they'll fight the battle that God has to fight, but they're not gonna initiate it. Obviously, the Herodians, they didn't want the Romans to go. They were their patron, if you will. So their dynasty depended on Roman involvement. So the Herodians had no issue with the Romans. The Sadducees, we have no evidence they thought the Romans were a problem either, because the Romans allowed them to operate the temple the way they wanted to. They had a temple guard, so they weren't that interested in any sort of status change. Now the Pharisees, they wanted the status change, but they wanted it done kind of from the ground up. So they believed that their job was to get all the Jewish people to fully embrace the Torah as they understood it. And when that happened, when the nation reached a certain level of holiness, that the Messiah would come, right? So yes, they wanted the Romans gone, but they weren't really advocating for it. Now that swung a bit right before the Jewish-Roman War, and probably was a big part of how the Zealots kind of got this to happen, is they kind of got the Pharisees on their side. But after Jerusalem was conquered by the Zealots, and after they started doing some things that the Pharisees thought were inappropriate, and the Pharisees started to see this was going to go really badly, they pulled back from it. And they were the ones that kind of had to be there when everything fell apart. As we mentioned, they were the groups that made it through. As I've already mentioned, if you're talking about Jesus's group called the Way, he just didn't believe in fighting and killing, right? And there's some evidence, and I'll wrap it up here in a moment, that Judas Iscariot, you've probably read different theories about this, that he was really trying to force Jesus's hand, because after he sells the information about where to find him, and he realizes he's arrested and all this is happening, he tries to give money back, and then he kills himself, right? So if he was simply in it for the money, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So one of the theories this has some possibility is that he was trying to force Jesus to take up the sword. And so as you recall in that scene, when they come to arrest him, Peter does, right? Peter takes out the sword, he starts to fight, and Jesus, stops it. So, Jesus had been talking about the kingdom of God and blessed are the poor, and he had been talking about all these principles, and yet he had kept everything in a very non-violent sort of approach. And so I think there were those who thought, look, this guy's got to be the king. He's got to be the king. And let's, push him into a context where he'll fight. That's what people do. He's going to get scared. He's going to pick up the sword. And he's going to fight. And he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. Right. So he kept to what he believed all the way to the bitter end. Right. He laid his life down for what he believed in, and that is, you love your enemy. Right. That was a very serious thing for him. Right. So a lot of folks can talk about that sort of level of conviction. Very few people can go all the way, right? Because it wasn't just, being arrested, it was being scourged, probably in a very horrific way. We know the reason they counted how many times you hit is some sadistic person determined that a few more and you kill them. You don't want to kill them. You just want to get them hurting really bad, right? Because you still got to crucify, right? So you don't want to, destroy one opportunity for another, which is just, sadistically sick when you think about it. So he goes through all that, and we know he said a few things according to the Gospels. He didn't really say that much. And as you recall, when he's on the cross, he forgives the people who did this to him, right? So all the way through his ministry in Galilee, where the Zealots were trying to say, go to war, go to war, to go to war, he was saying, no, 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 no. Right, all the way to the cross, he kept his conviction. So it's extremely amazing, I think. Okay, well, we've run out of time. Thank you for your investment. Thank you for your questions and comments. We'll pick it up here next week. So take care, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks, Stephen.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.